Well, I'm just going to start by saying thank you so much for coming this morning or this evening, wherever you are in the world, or midday even. And welcome to this session, which is looking at His Holiness's advice about basic human values and their importance in the world. My name's Alison Murdoch, and I'm hosting the session. And I say host because we're going to do it a little bit like a chat show. I have 6 people who are going to sit on the couch with me and discuss things. And hopefully we'll also have a little bit of time to open up for questions and discussion. But we were saying just now, time is tight because this is a huge subject. We could have a 1-week conference on this subject. So maybe we're simply setting the scene and creating the cause for that to happen at a future date. So do excuse us if we have to run through things quite quickly. We'll try not to speak too quickly for people who don't have English as a first language. And although we're hoping to open things up for general discussion, there may not be a lot of time for that. And also, it'll have to be quite random who we include in that if a lot of people put their hands up. The session is divided very neatly into 2 halves. One half looks at the work that's already been done by the Foundation for Developing Compassion and Wisdom around secular ethics and basic human values. And the second session looks at what we're planning to do in the future, and particularly some new plans for next year. The other thing I have to say, of course, is that we're on Zoom. This is completely IT dependent. And although many prayers have been made for the smooth running of the technical side, we'll have to see what our shared karma is on that particular issue. So in terms of a motivation for this session, I'd like to suggest we all go quiet for a moment. And as Lama Yeshe used to say, to put the mind where the body is. Certainly not something that I do all day long, so I find it very helpful to be reminded of that. And I just wanted to share one of the quotes from His Holiness's wonderful message to universal education yesterday. He said, "If Shakyamuni Buddha were with us today, I'm confident that he would be promoting the cultivation of basic human values in a universal way. His teachings were always appropriate to the time and the specific needs of his audience. Today, these basic human values are the most important factor in helping us face the many challenges from climate change to the gap between rich and poor. Regardless of any differences we may have in terms of country, culture, or religion, it is vital that we recognize the oneness of humanity and acknowledge our dependence on each other for our survival." So let's hold that thought in our hearts and hope that our discussions this morning will help us take forward His Holiness's vision of promoting the cultivation of basic human values in a universal way. So I don't know how many people were able to listen to Lama Zopa's talk yesterday, but he spoke very passionately, very clearly about the importance of learning how to help others and at least not to harm them. That this is the very core, the heart of what we're doing. Back in 2004, I absolutely didn't have that in my mind when I went to see Lama Zopa Rinpoche for the first time. He'd given me the job of setting up the Foundation for Developing Compassion and Wisdom. And the buzzwords at that time, we're talking 16 years ago, were happiness, were mindfulness. I don't know if you all remember. That's what people were really concerned about. So I went to see Rinpoche in his beautiful house in California, surrounded by flowers, full of holy objects, and sat down in front of him. And he immediately started talking about the 16 human dharmas of King Songtsen Gampo, this text from the 8th century, where the great Buddhist king introduced these precepts for everyday life to help his people become more peaceful and become more harmonious. And Rinpoche said, I remember him saying, he said, the minute you live in this, your life will change. And to be quite honest, my heart kind of sank because it wasn't where I was at the time. You know, I thought universal education was going to share these enormous, deep philosophical truths, and bringing it back to basic human values really wasn't my vision. And it took me an awful long time to realize that that's what the world really needs in the 21st century. And this is our great hope for turning around the many problems that we face. 2 years later, in 2006, I was invited to give a presentation in Sydney by Tony, who was setting up the first international conference on happiness and its causes. And that gave me a first taste of how powerful this could be. He had really top level speakers from Australia and around the world. And so I was quite nervous. I'd flown over from England. I was there for the end of the first day. And they'd all given these deep, powerful, thoughtful presentations. And here was I presenting basic human values. And it absolutely captured people's imagination. I don't know if anybody is here who was there that day, but I remember Tony ringing me up in the evening and saying, well, you know, you had 20 people at your breakout group tomorrow. Well, I'm afraid it's now 200. You know, it was, I may not have got the figures exactly right, but just that sense that coming back to something that everybody understands, that's part of our absolute DNA and makeup as human beings, is very, very powerful. It was the same year that Lama Yeshe asked my dear colleague Daki Lee Oldershaw and I to put together the book, which was published a couple of years later. And in fact, when I left FTCW in 2014, the book had already printed over 10,000 copies in many different languages. We developed a course which has gone to over 25 countries, from Mongolia to Argentina to New Zealand to Latvia. And there've been all kinds of additional resources, like the one that Ceci presented yesterday for children, the Building Inner Strength online course, which is available for free. And I think Victoria told me quite recently she was contacted by somebody in Libya who was using it, which I find very inspiring. And then one of my absolute favorites, which is the app. And I think that's because a lot of us who were involved in the early days experienced the transformative power of the guidelines when we started applying one guideline to our daily activities. First, we were using little cards, if people remember those. And now the app, you can have it in your pocket and you can choose a guideline, or the universe can choose you a guideline for the day. And our experience is that can completely change the way your day goes and the way you encounter things and where you put your mind for the day. So that's the thing about these 16 human dharmas. They have a really practical effect on our daily life. And I think that's what our teachers have in mind. Anyway, so without speaking anymore, it's my huge pleasure to have been able to invite some guests from around the world to share this morning how they've been putting the guidelines into practice and also how they plan to do that in the future. There were so many people I could have chosen from, so I apologize to anybody who's got a wonderful story and isn't going to be on the couch this morning. But we're going to start with Jane Lewis, who I met about 10 years ago in Sydney. We were doing a 16 guidelines course there that remains one of my most vivid and enjoyable experiences of this program. And I was immediately impressed by her commitment to bringing basic human values into her work as an anti-racism trainer and facilitator, which of course is so very timely now. Jane, over to you.
Thanks so much, Alison. It's marvelous to be here and marvelous to hear you talk about Lama Yeshe. It's always good to hear him spoken of. As Alison said, I've been training, guided by an Aboriginal academic, Professor Yin Paradies, whom you will meet in just a little moment on the video that I'll show. For 8 years, I've been delivering 16 guidelines because as Yin's research showed, reinforcing, promoting positive norms is something that can break down the barriers between us. And so I used to do it with cards. Now during COVID times, I've put together some videos, which I will be premiering tomorrow. I'm very excited. And so what I'd like to do is share with you the final moments of this. The first video is all about racism and its sources. The second one is about its impacts, incredibly powerful stuff. This last one is a summary that includes the wisdom themes from the 16 guidelines, which are marvelous, marvelous statements that we can live our lives by. And so if you'll allow me, I'll share the screen and play. Anti-racism isn't a personal attack on white people. It's the racist reality we need to change. Anti-racism means making a commitment to respect anger and take a good hard look at others' realities and our own complicity until now. Everything is changing, so anything is possible. Everything we do and say arises from our thoughts.
You can look at systems, whatever they are, and see mostly white people. And you see mostly white people asking people of colour to continue to unpack their stories of racism rather than themselves unpacking why they might be racist, how they discovered their racism, and what they're doing to de-racialize their thinking, to decolonize their own brains, their own minds and way of thinking about things.
Every skillful action makes a better world. Anti-racism means practicing compassionate skills for releasing ourselves and others from prejudice. To look after others is to look after ourselves.
The antidote to racism is a profound embracing of the diversity of lifeways of the world. We're missing out the most by not embracing diversity on community, on love and care and creativity, everything that is beyond the kind of core of modern systems. So modern societies are so focused on competition, so focused on individualism, on merit, on achievement, on progress, on status. Beyond all those things is the beautiful world of human expression, working together, collaborating, and then doing that with all other life on the planet as well.
We change our minds when we want to change our minds. I'd love to hear anyone's reactions in the room, please. Tell us what you're thinking. Thank you. That was also, I forgot to mention my other associate, Hala Abdul Noor, who was born in Beirut. So we hope to be working together on a long-term anti-racism project, and the wisdom themes really encapsulate our approach to helping people to wake up and to understand what is going on, and what we must do to change it. Unless we start embracing each other, there's no way we can save the planet. So it's just a delight to show this to you. Thank you for looking.
Jane.
Yes.
Thank you so much. That was so powerful and an amazing start to our discussions this morning. I love that phrase, the beautiful world of working together and collaborating, which is exactly what we're doing. You know, it's amazing, isn't it? I'm sitting almost exactly the other side of the world from you. I'm in England and you're in Melbourne, Australia. And here we are collaborating with other friends from all across the world. We're going to move on, but hopefully we'll come back with a little bit of time to ask questions or comment. But I can see there are comments coming in on the chat, Jane. So, you know, hopefully that'll be helpful as well. And we really wish you well for tomorrow, the presentation of the full video. I don't know whether Lorena has been able to join us. is great.
Yes.
Fantastic. So Lorena is my second guest on the couch. I actually only met Lorena earlier this year when I was doing a survey of people who've been using the 16 guidelines and the different ways in which they've been doing that as a precursor to developing this new program. And I was really impressed with her clarity about using the guidelines and a whole range of different life experience that she was bringing to that. So Lorena, would you like to tell us something about yourself? Where are you today?
I'm in France, but I'm Mexican. So
fantastic. And you're studying in Saragossa, is that right?
Yeah, I'm doing a master's degree on mindfulness in the university in Saragossa in Spain.
Wonderful. Now, the particular conversation that sparked me was about you doing a workshop in Sri Lanka. Can you tell us a little bit about how that came about and what happened?
Yeah, it was quite a sudden project. We didn't really plan it for a long time. It just happened. We got together between Oilun Lee and Venerable Lectron and me. We met one day at the Vajrayogini Institute, and Venerable Lectron, she's a volunteer at this center for teenage girls or underage girls that have been sexually abused in Sri Lanka. And she wanted to bring the 16 guidelines to them, and presented us, and we decided to do this. So I went there and I gave a 3-week-long workshop to these girls. It was based on the 16 guidelines, but it also included a lot of trauma-sensitive yoga. And we basically tried to mix everything so that it would be really practical and useful for the girls, and also to see how it translated into self-care techniques. So during 3 weeks, I was kind of I had this role of kind of like a big sister for them. So I let them ask any kind of questions they had, and just try to share with them how they could take care of themselves and how could they build on some resilience to maybe heal a little bit and have probably a little bit of a better life, because they have no access to therapy of any kind.
Wow.
So,
and what did you learn from that experience? I mean, presumably there were lots of insights into what works and what doesn't work.
What struck me the most was when we were looking at aspiration, and I realized that no one had ever asked them what they wanted to do with their lives. Like, to me, it was just such a simple question in a way, like, to me, it had always been there in my life. Like, what do you want to do with your life? What do you aspire for, or to, for them, it was just like completely new. Like, I had to really brief them into the question, and that for me was a big eye opener of the potential of doing this, because I don't know, maybe we think it's just such an obvious question sometimes, but it's not, and it's so important. And so that was a huge insight for me. And then, well, many other things. It was just an amazing experience.
Wow, that's really moving. Have you got plans to do any more?
Well, we wanted to do it this last summer, but obviously we couldn't. But
Yes.
I would be very, very, very happy to do it again. Yeah.
Amazing. Is there anything else you'd like to add?
I think what was very important also for these teenage girls was to see how the 16 guidelines could apply into their relationships, and especially into love relationships, like romantic relationships. And to me, it was really cool to explore what respect means, what patience means, and also in the shadow side, like how far do you want to like set the boundaries with a person, with a romantic partner. And that was really cool, really amazing, and that's definitely something I would like to explore more in the future.
Wow. Lorena, thank you very, very much for
Thanks.
sharing a little bit with us, and please stay on and contribute to the discussion. So my third guest on the couch in this part of the session, which is looking at the 16 guidelines work that's already been done, just giving people a taste of these amazing projects around the world. I'd like to introduce you to Denise Flora, who's got up incredibly early in the morning in North Carolina. We connected with each other about 15 years ago, and this was very characteristic really, because we wanted to develop a children's resource, which was eventually published as Ready, Set, Happy. And we put out an advert. And Denise, who I don't think I'd encountered before then, got in touch and she said, well, actually, I've already been integrating the 16 guidelines with my family and with my local community. And I'm very happy to share this with you. And that's my experience of Denise, this incredible, quiet, steady, integrated approach, bringing the 16 guidelines into every area of her life. So Denise, I'll hand over to you.
Hey, good morning. It's morning for me. Good morning, afternoon, evening, whatever time it is for you. Yeah, Alison asked me to talk a little bit about using 16 guidelines with my family, in particular in our community. And what I realized thinking about it was kind of how those boundaries weren't so clear. We started out, the first time I reached out was because we wanted to make a set of posters to go up on the walls for Sunday school. And so I was just looking for the list of 16 words. And that turned into a project, which I love. We're having the analogy of the couch, because all three of my little stories have to do with sitting on the couch with someone and talking about these big ideas. So to come up with what photographs to use in those posters, I sat on the couch with my then 9 or 10-year-old. And every Sunday we would just sit on the couch and go through the materials from the Happiness and Its Causes conference booklets that you mentioned earlier, Alison. And we would think, how could we represent this particular quality with a photograph? And so my son and I would brainstorm. And then during that week, every morning on his way out to school, on his way back in, we would touch base on that particular ethic, that positive quality. And we would just talk about how we had noticed it that day and how we might represent that visually. And then once we came up with our ideas, and that was a wonderful thing, snuggled on the couch with him, talking about the big ideas. I loved it. We came up with these ideas, and then I had my music students help to model for the photographs. And we eventually, it took years before we actually got them up on the wall, but we had projects that went from idea of doing something for the community that became a family project. And of course, I got to sit with the ideas myself and enrich about them. And that was the way everything turned out to be. It kind of morphed from where the focus was. Was it personal work I was doing? Was it work I was doing with my family? Or was it something we were doing in the community? Then more proactively, I did a project with my teenage son. He wanted to take apart 3 of my guitars and build a kind of a Frankenstein guitar. So I said, okay, but it's going to cost you an hour on each one of the guidelines. And so again, on the couch, I had him sit with me for an hour at each guideline. And the frame I used for him was by that time we had Ready, Set, Happy with 6 activities for each guideline. So I said, let's go through each chapter, one session at a time. And you tell me which of these activities would be appropriate to do with a teenage audience, which ones wouldn't, how would they need to be modified? And so whereas my young son and I, the sort of physical feeling of it was a close and a snuggling, with my teenage son, it was kind of more like this. And but he did it, and I could tell he heard me. And I reflect on that time as really precious, that I got to talk to him about the ideas that were big ideas that were important. And later he came to me and said, in college, he said, oh, Mom, I read this book at school. It's called Man's Search for Meaning. I think you would really like it. And so that told me he kind of knew, you know, that this was where we were going with it. And then later on, he came to me and he said, I want to work on my anger, but I don't want any of that Buddhist crap. And so then I was able to recommend some other books to him. The third project was something with my mother. And I interviewed her around the 16 guidelines. And that's what I love, is this frame, this structure, this comprehensive list, you know, because one session, each guideline with her, I asked her when she had observed this guideline, when she thought she had demonstrated it, who was her personal role model for each one of these. And I learned stories I never heard. And I'm the genealogist for my family, and I hadn't heard stories that brought up some amazing examples of people in our extended family who had supported her in difficult times. And, you know, one individual I'm thinking of in particular is someone I didn't have a lot of respect for, honestly. But when I learned how he had been so supportive to someone so dear to me, it really opened my eyes to sort of how complex each one of us is. And if he was capable of that kind of compassion for her, then maybe I needed to be more open-minded about everybody that I might have made a snap judgment about. So that was a family project, but it turned into a very personal work for me and learning. And now it's a community project because we wrote up our process and have posted. I'll put a link in the chat where you can go to see the links to all of these things if you'd like to find out more about any of them. But it's a way we can interview seniors. Any of you could use it to interview seniors. You could use the 16 guidelines or any other list of positive ethics to work through with someone, and it gives people a chance to reflect on some of the important moments in their life. It's a way to do a life review, or just a way to spend some meaningful time with somebody who's, you know, quarantined right now. A lot of our seniors are isolated. And so, you know, as my kids have aged up and as I have aged up, it's been interesting to get to apply this really flexible framework to work with the children in my family, the teens in the family, the adults in the family. So I think that's enough to start. Thank you, Alison. I can't hear you. You're muted, sweetie.
Alison, sorry, you're on mute, Alison.
It probably won't surprise you to know that I was saying thank you to Denise, to Lorena, to Jane. I mean, I'm deeply moved every time I hear from you about the work that you've been doing. Of course, time is rolling on faster than we'd hoped. We've maybe got time for one person to ask a question, just to show that we've, even just as a symbol of the fact that we would love this to be a wider discussion. Is there anybody who wants to raise their hands? That's probably the easiest way to do it. Maybe Michaela or Angela, you can just unmute one person who raises their hands.
Listen, I think it would be easiest if the participants wrote a question into chat. They're very easy to monitor, so the chat is open.
Thank you. We have experts with us. Please, let's see what comes up in chat. Or maybe we're just also affected by the presentations. We're just sitting with it quietly. I'm going to suggest that actually we do move on at this point, and then we can, hopefully we'll have a little bit more time at the end, but we have 3 more guests to come, and I'm just going to give a brief introduction as to what's happening at the moment and what we hope is going to happen in the future. So about this time last year, Victoria Coleman, who's the director of FTCW, very kindly approached me and said that there was interest in updating the 16 guidelines, which makes complete sense. It's been around now for 14 years or so, which is 14 years of incredible grassroots experience to bring to a new version. And we talked about how we're actually in a different world now, you know, where in 2016 there was this tremendous interest in happiness. That almost seems out of date. I mean, from a Buddhist point of view, there's a very deep definition of happiness, but in the world, the people around me, I see them thinking about transformation. I see them thinking about survival. You know, there's a different focus at the moment. So we decided to go back to the original text. And that has proved to be an extraordinarily rich experience. I'm working with an international group of people to create a commentary on this text, which can then be adapted for different audiences around the world. And it will be different from the 16 guidelines. So to give you an idea, the one that we called humility in a general way in the 16 guidelines, the original piece of advice from King Songtsen Gampo was, have a sincere and stable attitude, not going along with everything that others might say. And you look at the world around us, the social media, the fake news, you know, what's happening with populist governments, and you think, wow, this is actually so relevant to our times. Or another one, number 10, which we called contentment, which, you know, all sorts of wonderful work's been done around contentment, but this is now very, very precise. Know how to enjoy food and wealth without being too extreme. So in terms of the whole world, we can see this is about not consuming too much, you know, too much of the world's resources is the key to climate change. But there's also, and of course, the whole thing around food, the fact that half the world is facing childhood obesity and the other half of the world, I mean, it's not 50-50, you know, is terrible, is looking at starvation and not enough food to go around. But of course, it also brings it right back to the issue of our own minds and the issue of desire, you know, our own lack of contentment, which leads us to seek satisfaction from external objects. And it doesn't take very long to realize that that really isn't going to work. So we've been working on this new version, and the challenge, of course, will be how to connect with new audiences. You know, if we're passionate about the potential of this material to bring about changes in people's individual lives and on a global scale, how do we share that for people with whom ethics is pretty much a subject where you roll your eyes? I mean, it is so countercultural. So I went back to my great friend, Deki Lee, who's working with me on this project. And we're about to play a short video that she sent us because it's the middle of the night in Canada where she lives. For people who don't know Deki Lee, she was one of the founding board members of FDCW, but she's got a much longer commitment to universal education. She set up transformative mindfulness methods, which we're going to hear from later in the week, one of the presentations. And she's just frankly one of the most sensitive and accomplished facilitators I have ever come across. And I think you'll get a taste of that in this short video that she sent us. And sorry, just before we play it, I should say my question to Deki Lee was, His Holiness the Dalai Lama keeps saying, young people hold the future in their hands. So if we want to teach the 16 guidelines or share the 16 guidelines in some way with the younger generation, what's the best way to go about it? So this was my question to her.
Thank you, Alison, for asking me to talk about this. When you first asked me, my mind went instantly to, I wouldn't teach. I'd let them teach me. Let me explain a little more of what that comes from. For me, when I'm introducing anything to do with these guidelines, the first thing I'm doing is not approaching them as guidelines, but setting up a situation and an environment that's so safe that these pour from them. So for me, the most important part of any of the exploration, while there may be some exercises or some reflections or meditations, by no means do I ever teach. For me, the pearl comes in the sharing, which isn't necessarily debriefing exercises, but sharing from their hearts in their guts when a quality didn't happen. And sometimes that can be really atrocious stories. And as soon as they know that it's safe to share something like this, then the energy opens right up. And then the wisdom comes pouring in. It's a joy to be there. So again, I make it a point not to teach. And one of my most important questions comes at different times. So based on this experience, what do you now know? In your heart, in your gut, what do you know now? And here comes all the wisdom. And very seldom have I needed to add anything. And if there's something blatantly missing from what I'd like them to take away, all I need to say is, has anyone experienced X? And of course the hands go up. And then we're sharing another part of that quality. So walking away from it, I haven't taught a thing. All I've done is think of what would I want taught and what questions poignantly help them to identify it in their life so they can share it in a safe way. So all I'm looking for is questions. So in the time they're together, we're starting with safety first, and then communing through sharing, and then community before they leave. That's where wisdom comes through. Or that's what I've found. I hope that helps to answer your question to begin with. And we're going to hear some other great experiences. Thanks so much, Alison.
Thank you, Daiki Lee. So one of the things I love about Daiki Lee's contribution is that it highlights so clearly the challenges that face those of us who are coming from Tibetan Buddhism into universal education. I know that's not everybody, but our experiences of sitting at the feet of highly revered masters, very often taking teachings, it's quite vertical. And the challenge of universal education is to be horizontal, is to come back to ourselves as human beings, as His Holiness says so often. And as Daiki Lee says, the pearl comes in the sharing as human beings. So I'd like to invite two more people to join me on the couch to discuss this. Firstly, Anna Kaleo, who has been involved with universal education since the very beginning and has a particular passion for working with young people. And one of my favorite moments of working with her was when Anna approached me with the idea of taking the 16 guidelines to youth centres around the UK, working with a hip hop band. So Anna, I don't necessarily expect you to speak about that today, but at least maybe to share a little bit of your reaction to what Daiki Lee's just said to us.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you. And thank you to all the other presenters. It's been amazing. I really feel that what Daiki Lee said about circular learning and this aspect of us all being together is really important. When working with young people, particularly young people who have experienced, trauma, abuse, potentially been trafficked, have really, their perception of reality has been very much changed by the experiences they've had, it's incredibly important for the guidelines to be grounded in that experience rather than seeing it as other. And I think particularly with rap, but lots of the creative arts, there's this massive potential because the art itself is helping the transformative process, that then if you can feed, reflect, write the art, ask the right questions, as Daiki Lee said, the wisdom comes naturally, even through the trauma. So, I mean, lots of exercises, I think it was mentioned before, using the shadow side of the guidelines. So a lot of the young people I work with don't really get contentment, don't really understand patience, but they have experience of anger. They have experience of feeling, you know, desperate and fearful. And that's been a great way in. I mean, reframing has also been really positive to use. And I think the main thing is that it's based in people's own experiences and we're opening the heart center to their own positive potential. And at this time, more than any other time, there's a shift in collective consciousness. Young people themselves are moving towards ethics and moving towards ecology. And for me, it's just such an exciting time to be doing this work, revisiting it, opening this heart space again. It's very inspirational. Thank you, Alison.
Anna, thank you so much. And I'm now going to move on to our last guest, which is dear friend Paul Wielgus. Paul, I was trying to work out when I last saw you during this weird coronavirus year, and I think it was when we were putting up Extinction Rebellion banners across motorway bridges. So Paul is a very long-term Buddhist practitioner, but he also shares my love of activism, of boots on the ground. Paul, over to you.
Thanks, Alison. And what an amazing event this is. I feel such a privilege to be here. The previous speakers are just wonderful. I want to speak from my experience as an activist, working with activists, many of them young. And I really do embrace and endorse the idea of horizontal learning, a safe space where the natural creativity and potential can come out of the people that we're working with. But I think one of the things is, how do we get them into the safe space? And my own experience is that just broadcasting on media just doesn't work. They don't trust what you're offering. And I found that to find, get a word of mouth going, find the people who support what you're doing, and they can act as super spreaders. So it's got to be very granular in that way too, so people have confidence in what you're offering. And what else, I believe is really important to offer in that space is mindfulness, transformational mindfulness training, in order that the activists can really embed the values, so that when they have values, they have good values, they're doing what they're doing because of that. But it's very difficult that when you're at the sharp end sometimes to access those values. So training to embed them, I think, is absolutely essential. And the last thing is that if we're inviting people into these spaces, it's really helpful to be an activist yourself. They want to be working with people who have been at the sharp end as well and are doing the work. So those I think are 4 things that are really important. Back to you, Alison.
Wow, thank you, Paul. Enormous amount to think about there. Well, the lovely thing about my speakers having been so focused and so, punchy, to be honest, about what you've been saying, is that does allow us a good 10 minutes to take some questions. So I'd like anybody who has questions for the speakers or would simply like to make a contribution from their own experience to put something into chat, and we will include as much as we possibly can. Right, we've been asked for a link to the root text of King Songtsen Gampo. We'll need to do that offline. Has anybody got any questions coming up from the contributions that we've had while we have all these amazing practitioners in the room with us? Or there might be somebody who's been using the 16 guidelines themselves in an interesting way and would like to speak very briefly about that.
Yes, Alison, Pigpin here.
Hello, Pigpin.
Yes, from Malaysia. So yesterday, Lama Rinpoche spoke about action beside the words and action. I know 16 guidelines have many materials to share, and he spoke about the 10 Wali Dharma. So I'm wondering whether 16 guidelines and the 10 Dharma, where the 10 virtuous, will we be looking into how to link these two together?
I think it's a really interesting point, because he spoke with me many years ago about this as well. I've found a little teaching recently that the 16 human dharmas are about improving our life in this lifetime. And the 10 divine dharmas, which a lot of us from the Buddhist tradition might know as the 10 non-virtuous actions, but of course they can be flipped to be positive, are actually about our future lives. So it was fairly recently that I understood that distinction. Pik Pin, I imagine now that we have a wealth of experience from around the world that we could bring to the task of taking the 10 divine dharmas out. But when and how it actually happens would be a question for Victoria. I have a big enough job at this moment.
Thank you.
But I think it's a really interesting point to raise. Have we got any other questions or contributions? I can see a hand up from Rosemary. Rosemary Ramsey, can you unmute yourself? Are you allowed to unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm doing that. Thank you.
Great.
I've got a question for Jane Lewis. I was very moved by your presentation and the video. I wondered if it's part of an organization or how you're working in relation to racism and in relation to working with Aboriginal people.
Thank you so much for your question, Rosemary. I have the great joy of having many Aboriginal friends with whom I spend a lot of time, and I hope to be going up there after this rather high pressure presentation that I've got tomorrow. But I've been working with a lot of government departments at local, at state and at federal levels, delivering anti-racism training. Frankly, the sort of anti-racism training that Donald Trump has tried to ban.
Yes.
But the client that I'm presenting to tomorrow is a corporation, and so it's a very different emphasis, and their enthusiasm to create something really emotionally powerful has been an inspiration for me. And I've been working with Yin, of course, who's Aboriginal. Hala's work has been incredible, but it's pretty exciting to be able to be approached with a really long-term project in mind. And so we hope if they like what I present on tomorrow, then we hope to be working with them over 2 years, gradually uncovering all of the layers of white privilege and white exceptionalism and fragility, and using all of the skills that I've heard talked about today to wake people up, to get past this, to get past the defensiveness, to get past the denial, to get past it. Really crucially is the idea that sometimes we think that sympathy bestows a cloak of innocence on us. That simply feeling moved by the suffering of others is enough to make us progress. It's not. This is so much about internal work, about inner transformation, and about opening our hearts, as Yin said so movingly at the end, to all beings, to accepting the diversity of all beings. So it's a great honor and an enormous privilege to do this work as a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, to rely so much on the help of non-white trainers and experts. But at the same time, as a WASP, I'm in a unique position to start joining the dots for people who are mostly, to such an extent, at a beginning stage of their journey. I'm sure I've seen some of the literature about Jan Willis's work in Buddhist organizations, and the sorts of defensiveness that she encounters even amongst people who consider themselves very wise and compassionate. And so these are big stuff. But so practical.
Yes. I really, your work with a big corporation over years sounds completely amazing, and I wish you all the best with that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosemary.
It would be good to have some contact with you.
Please, I've put my email address in the chat.
Okay.
jane@janelewis.com.au. Please keep in touch.
Lovely.
I'd be absolutely delighted. And I'll let people know when I get the right permissions to be able to share some of the gutsy parts of the videos. As a whole, they can't yet be shared, but that day will come. So,
fantastic.
It's really wonderful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. So we've probably got time for another question, possibly two. Somebody else?
Hello. I've got a question.
Oh,
Alison, this is
Fabienne. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much. And thank you to all the presenters. This has been, it just feels like such a breakthrough to be able to hear like how this program touches different communities and helps, and to hear those experiences is profoundly moving. So I want to thank FDCW and all the speakers for putting this festival together. It's absolutely mind-blowing, as Geshe Namdak, our resident teacher, would say. Alison, you mentioned that 15, 16 years ago, when you started this process of 16 guidelines, the focus really was very much on happiness at the time. And how 15, 20 years later, it just seems things have moved on. And now in so many ways, we're struggling with climate change, and you mentioned it seems more we're in survival mode. And so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about this revision or update of the 16 guidelines that you guys have been working on. How is it changing to meet these new challenges, and how would you describe that? And maybe that's a big question, but how is it evolving to meet those new challenges?
Okay, thank you for the question. And it is a huge subject, and I'll just try and say a few things to give people an idea. It's proved to be an extremely iterative, collaborative process, which is different from before. In 2014, 2016, we were a new organization, wanting to make our mark. We had the idea of creating a book that would really connect with people, that would bridge this wisdom directly and make a splash and form a foundation for the work. And I think we're seeing some of the wealth of that today, because the people who've spoken are only a tiny representation of the work that's been going all over the world. And I hope that we feel it does answer to some extent Lama Zopa's encouragement to not just be in words, but to do action. This is really happening. And particularly Bob, the Building on the Basics short course always ends with a practical project. And if people want to hear more about these tools, then Wendy and Marion, I think, are running a session on Thursday morning, and really recommend that to you. In terms of the 16 human dharmas, I'm coming from it from such a different space now, because, for example, if one of my heart dreams would be to see the 16 guidelines go out to young activists who are working in the climate movement or in the justice movement or whatever, between, say, 18 to 30-year-olds, it's completely clear that I can't write for that group. I might, we might be able to mentor them to write something for themselves, or we might be able to work with them, but we can't use their language, and we can't even necessarily know what forms they'd choose. Maybe the 16 Human Dharmas would become a set of Instagram memes. Maybe they would be podcasts. The idea of a book, that feels almost last century, although a book will work for some people. So what we're doing in the one stage at a time is creating what is effectively a modern commentary on the original 8th century text. Quite short, about 1,200 words on each of them, so it'll be 40, 50 pages long. And at the moment, I don't know if it'll stick, we're using the framework of the Four Noble Truths. So we're actually saying, well, what is the problem that we're facing in the modern world? Why is it a problem? Where does it come from, particularly its psychological roots? Could things be different? We have to bring in the Tantra as well as the Sutra. Can we imagine a life where corporations aren't trying to cheat us, where there isn't small print in every contract, where manufacturers are honestly designing the shape and size of their bottles so that you can see what's inside rather than trying to disguise them so you only get half of what you thought you were going to get? Or food where the ingredients are honestly labeled, they're not sneaking in, the nasty chemicals under names that we won't recognize. Just the idea, for example, of living in a world where everybody aspired to honesty, and honesty was the theme of our public life. That it's quite hard almost to go there at the moment, which really shows, the degenerate times that we find ourselves in. And then lastly, practical next steps. What can you do? But what I see being added to that text, possibly through a vast collaborative online process, is adding the collateral, adding the scientific material that we can keep up to date with what really, where the evidence really lies in ways that a lot of people will relate to more easily than the philosophical stuff, adding the psychological information, adding quotes, adding role models, adding examples, and the whole thing might become very much more dynamic than the previous program. So instead of having one role model for each guideline, which will never represent the full cultural diversity of the people that we're working with, our interdependent world, and which will go out of date, as we've seen with Aung San Suu Kyi. We can create something that is really living and that is an amazing resource for people around the world. So, which more or less brings us up to our end time, and I hope in a helpful and a constructive way. I'd like to invite everybody who's involved in this to share your thoughts with us, to stay involved. Please consider whether you'd like to be part of this initiative. And I'd like to end with a short dedication, if that's okay. Dedication is a very Buddhist thing to say. Instead, maybe let's just think about an intention from our time together. And as people who know me well know, I tend to keep coming back to the word kindness. To me, if you wanted a single word to sum up this work, that is the word. And of course, His Holiness the Dalai Lama, who is our honorary patron, has said on so many occasions, my religion is kindness. So that's what we're working with today. I'd like to particularly mark the kindness of the FDCW team, Angela and Michaela, who've made this session this morning possible, and all the work that's gone into creating the festival for us all and offering it so courageously and so generously for free. And I'd like to invite each of you to just recall quickly some of the things that have been said over the last hour and think of anything that has particularly touched you. And just enjoy experiencing a moment of gratitude for that. And let's quietly each make a wish to put these values, and particularly to put kindness, into practice during the coming day. Thank you so much.